Linda is a therapist and is going to talk about trauma and trauma care for inmates and for anyone, in any of the situations that they find themselves in. I think we're becoming more and more aware that gaining wholeness and completeness, we have to deal with the issues that we bring with us. And so, just without further ado, let me say thank you for coming.
Thanks, Roshi. So hello, everyone. I'm really happy to be here. I'll start with a little bit of an introduction. He introduced me, and I want to just make sure I tell you right up front, I actually don't have much experience in prisons at all, and that my expertise is much more in the trauma-informed care. And so I'm going to speak as a social worker and also as a Buddhist teacher. So that's the other part of my background. But I'm really coming to you as a social worker, addressing some of what was brought up earlier about the mental health issues, and trying to make sure that as we deal with inmates, clients, whatever we want to call them, that we actually think about them and what their needs are and what brought them there. And so together in this workshop, Roshi Taigen and I are going to talk about the fact that in order to truly understand them, we have to actually have a starting point in imagining them as people and imagining their pasts, imagining the history that brought them to that point, and then figuring out how do we actually talk to them? What do we have to actually keep in mind? So I'm going to tell you a little bit about something called polyvagal theory, and I don't want any of you to kind of freak out and go, what? But I want you to know that what we're learning about trauma-informed care is that there's a neuroscience behind it. And one of the things that I think is so strong about this gathering here today is we have people from all backgrounds. We have chaplains, but chaplains don't work by themselves. It's not simply a spiritual discussion we're having. We're having these discussions with people, first and foremost. And so in order to understand that, we have to see them for who they are. We have to think about them as whole people. And so what I'm going to hope to do, let me know at the end of my presentation if I've done it, but what I'm hoping to do is to introduce to you a little bit about how neuroscience actually informs the way that we deal with people, whether we're chaplains, whether we're social workers, regardless of whether we're volunteers, whoever we are working with inmates, we need to actually understand the larger picture. So I'm going to break this down. You might notice I put a word in there, a simple explanation. I put that in my title because I don't come to you as an expert. I'm not a neuroscientist. I don't come to you as an expert in polyvagal theory, but I hope that what I tell you about today perks your interest in understanding some of the body influence of how we have these conversations. If you have questions along the way, you're welcome to ask. We'll also have time for discussion at the end, but if you have specific questions like clarification questions, you're welcome to let me know. So a woman by the name of Claire Bodkin, who's a Canadian, published an article in the American Journal of Public Health with statistics. And so I wanted to include this slide in case any of you have any doubt that inmates are actual trauma survivors, that trauma has brought them there, and that it's not just a few people. But if you look at the statistics, you see that the number of prison inmates who've experienced physical abuse is 57.7%, more than half. Sexual abuse, for women it's over half, 50.4. For men it's a bit lower at 20.8. For emotional abuse, it's again about half and half. Neglect, nearly half. And when we combine all the trauma that prison inmates admit to, say they've experienced, it's 65.7%, and for men it's 35.5%. So there has to be, so we have to have our eyes and ears opened to this idea that there is trauma in the inmates, and we need to make sure we bring a lens of looking at the services that we're bringing to them through a trauma-informed care. So that brings me to polyvagal theory. So this is a scientific theory. It was explained by a man by the name of Stephen Porges, and he talks about how trauma impacts the body and how it impacts the body through the autonomic nervous system. So it would have just stayed a scientific theory, but a social worker by the name of Deb Dana brought it into clinical practice. And then it was also, there's a graphic that I'm going to share with you later that Megan Moore, who's another social worker, used to describe it. And I wanted to let you know that the way I came to know polyvagal theory was through a type of psychotherapy called EMDR, eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. And so this is a training that is specifically for trauma-informed care. It's gotten a lot of research, and it is based on polyvagal theory. So what is polyvagal theory? Essentially, it's the theory that says that the role of the autonomic nervous system shapes clients' experiences of safety and affects their ability to connect. So as a chaplain, as a social worker, as a volunteer, whoever you are going into the prison, if you want to connect with people, you have to understand that those inmates' sense of safety has often been compromised. And you have to understand what it looks like. How do you know? Well, what it looks like. So the word polyvagal comes from poly meaning many, and vagal being the vagus nerve that connects the brain, the heart, and the gut. Now, many people know, if you've worked with abuse survivors, traumatized people, you know that they have an extremely high proportion of physical symptoms in the body related to brain stuff, migraines, headaches, related to heart stuff, panic attacks, breathing, and gut stuff, chronic irritable bowel syndrome, all kinds of stomach issues. And we now have a scientific theory that helps say, yeah, it's connected, and it's the vagal nerve that actually is the explanation for it. Now, can I also say, I see a number of you frantically scribbling. You're welcome to if you want. If anybody wants a copy of the slides, I'm happy to share them afterwards. Just send me an email and I'll share them as well. So if that makes a difference to how much you scribble, that's also a possibility. So there's really three principles to this idea of polyvagal theory. So there's a hierarchy. This is one of the principles, which means there's really three pathways that operate in an evolutionary order, from oldest to newest. So the oldest one is the dorsal vagus, which is all about immobilization. The sympathetic nervous system, which is about the mobilization. And the ventral vagus, which is about the social engagement and connection and the capacity to engage and talk and be with other people. Now, I'm going to go on to explain in a few minutes about what that means. So don't worry if you're left kind of scratching your head going, what? Immobilization? What does that look like? I'll tell you. Just hang on. But I wanted to introduce these principles. So the second one is about neuroception. And this is this idea that safety and danger are programmed into us as human beings. We're animals, we have instincts, and these are programmed into us within our bodies, and they're necessary. So we need to have these instincts that tell us whether the world is safe or not. And then the third principle is about co-regulation and understanding the biological imperative that must be met in order to sustain our lives. And so as human beings, we sometimes have fear responses as if we're not going to survive. And again, that's one of the basic principles that says this is necessary as a human being. And this has been programmed into us for a reason, and we have to understand what that looks like in our interactions with people. All right, so, oh, what happened here? I lost the, all right, imagine that there's three groups of three. Somehow my slide went a little bit funny. But let's look at the three here together. They're three groups of three. And this is what I'm calling an autonomic ladder. because essentially what happens is people generally start in a good space, which means the ventral vagal is operating. We feel safe and we have social interactions. So I'm guessing most of us in this room here today are in that zone. We're feeling calm, we're able to connect with people, we have conversations, and we're good. However, if something happens in our environment that makes us afraid, we start climbing down the autonomic ladder. And we go down to the next chunk of 3, which is the sympathetic nervous system kicks in, we're mobilized, and we consider fight or flight. And so what that means is when we begin to feel a little afraid, and so this might be a chaplain having a conversation. Tell me why you're here. Who are you? A simple conversation might take someone into this, oh no, what does this mean, kind of zone. And they might not be able to sort of stay present and be able to have a conversation because you're kind of triggered back into a conversation that's a little scary. So as a result, you might see some fight or flight. And again, in a few minutes, I'll talk even more about what that looks like. And if things get even worse, and in a prison system, things sometimes get worse, right? So this could be anything from a person being in segregation for a while, it could be some kind of a lockdown, it could be some kind of a confrontation. There's a lot of different things that might happen in the prison system that suddenly put somebody into the bigger fear. And this is the deeper next level of fear, where someone goes into the dorsal vagal, which is part of the completely immobilized, frozen, unable to move, collapsed system. Often not able to talk, not able to stay present, and it's an even deeper level of fear and panic. So, bringing this into a more simple way of imagining it, there's really 3 levels of brain activity. And similar to the ladder I just used in the last slide, most people want to stay in what we're calling within the window. Within the window of affect tolerance where you're calm, you're able to handle things, the stress is not too bad, and things are okay. And so when you're talking with somebody, you usually know when they are in the window. And the window is where good therapeutic connection works. There's a good connection in that kind of sense. They're able to have good conversations. And then occasionally you'll find them going up into the hyperarousal, and then also sometimes going down into the hypo. So if you know your, is it Latin? I'm not sure. Hypo. Hyper means too much, right? Energetic, too much energy. And the hypo is the opposite. It's the too little. It's the lower level of things. And so the way it looks on a weekly basis, imagine this is like a week-long graph of how someone feels. So the blue in the middle is within the window, the calm affect. The green is the hyper arousal, and the red at the bottom is the hypo. And so what might happen is, a prison inmate might be going along, and they have various conversations, they have various interactions, various experiences within the week. And they start out kind of within the window, and they might have a confrontation with a roommate if they have one. And it suddenly takes them out of the window, and they're up into a little hyper, and things are getting a little out of hand, but then they come back down again. And they're okay, and they go up again a little bit of fear, but they're able to kind of stay in the window. And then perhaps something big will happen. And it might be an internal experience, it might be an external experience, but something takes them up and out into a panicky situation. Perhaps it's an angry outburst, it's a confrontation with someone, and you can see they're suddenly spending maybe 2 or 3 days up in the hyper zone, where they are like, you know, energetic and having too much of affect, too much emotion that they're not able to handle. And then eventually they might come out of that zone and go down, boom, 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 all the way down into a sort of depression, where they don't talk to anyone, and they might spend time, maybe some suicidal thoughts, who knows, but they actually spend time in the red zone for a day or two where things are hopeless. And then you can see it goes back up again. And so you can watch this, and there's various events, again, internal or external, that might take them up or down over the course of a week. And when you're talking with these people, it's really helpful to picture where they are. So again, this is not particularly scientific, this graph. This is just a sense of having a framework of imagining where they're at with their trauma. Are they able to connect with you, or are they like gone into the past somewhere and sort of lost to you when you're trying to interact with them? So to understand the hyper and hypo arousal, it helps to understand our brains. So we have essentially 3 brains. And again, from oldest to newest. We start with the brainstem, which is really the oldest brain, the dinosaur brain. I attended a training recently with a child therapist who brings out stuffed animals to talk about the brains, the various brains. And when she talks to the children about the oldest brain, this brainstem, she brings out a dinosaur and she talks to them and says, "Tell me when your dinosaur brain is talking." And then as she goes into the other one, she's got other stuffies to describe the other ones. And it was very graphic for me. I could really I could imagine myself as a child picturing it. So this is how I'm bringing this information to you, saying the word polyvagal might be totally new, but the ideas are digestible. So the dinosaur brain is the oldest part of our brain. It includes the amygdala. We talk a lot about the amygdala often when it comes to trauma. It's the instinctual brain. It has all the automatic functions, you know, eating, sleeping, walking, defecating. All of these are part of the automatic parts of our brain. And then there's a second one that develops a bit later in childhood. It slowly develops, and it's the animal brain. It's called the cerebellum, and it includes body movements, balance, and our body functions. And then the third one that develops, and this one is often not fully developed until the late teens, and that's the cerebrum. That's the human brain. So this child therapist, she described it as the dinosaur, and then she had a cow. Okay, that's like the animal brain. And then the third one was a doll, a human. And these are the 3 kinds of brains as they develop. And so with the human brain, that's when the analytical functions happen, and that's when a person is able to engage more analytically and have an understanding. So when you're dealing with someone who's experienced trauma, you want to understand, have they actually gotten past the dinosaur brain, or are they literally still functioning at, like, you know, an infant 2-year-old level? Have they developed their animal brain? Have they developed the human brain? And are they able to actually engage with you in that way or not? Because many people who've been traumatized never actually get past that, never get all the way to the human brain development. So I mentioned earlier that I would describe a little bit about what some of these stages look like. So hyperarousal is about the sympathetic nervous system and having the sympathetic nervous system engaged. And when someone is in this hyperarousal state, their their social engagement is off, which means literally they often can't engage in conversation. They're not able to answer questions. When you ask them, they're not able to sort of connect with you. They're maybe a little suspicious. What do you want from me? It's that kind of lack of trust that is shows you that they're actually in hyperarousal. And during that hyperarousal, you'll see the fight, flight, freeze, and attach cry responses. And my next slide will tell you about that. But in general, it's this overwhelm of intensity and energy. So there's a freneticness about it. It's too much. Everything feels too much, too loud, it's out of control, and you can tell by the body, people can't sit still, their legs are tapping, there's too much energy in the body. And during that time, they're not able to actually engage that human brain to have any kind of a constructive conversation with you. And so the most common aspects of this hyperarousal are fight or flight. They're very primal. It's not like a choice to go into fight or flight, but it's the only way of being. And so if someone's in a fight stage, they are literally, there's rage, you might see clenched fists, there's a furrowing of the brow, the pupils look different, the pupils get really dilated, there's a heart that races, the respiration, they're sweating, they're red, they're hot. You can see that they are ready to take you on, and no matter what you say, they're gonna argue. Anybody see these people have these conversations? It's a pretty common one, isn't it? And the flight is, again, a very energetic hyperarousal, but they're trying to get the heck out of here. And maybe their bodies are in the room with you, but they're actually trying to flee. The eyes are darting, there's this urgent movement, you see it in hands and feet, there's racing thoughts, and there's a level of impulsivity and a desire to sort of be anywhere else but there. And the prison system is interesting because usually people who might normally flee are not able to. They are stuck there. And when you're stuck in a place where you want to flee, it often just gets worse. And you'll see people will get stuck in the desire to flee without having any way to be able to handle it. Then there's two other options that are part of the hyperarousal, and this is the attach cry or freeze. And attach cry is if you imagine a baby who thinks it's gonna die, and it knows it needs help, and it attaches to any human being that might help it. And it does so by crying, it does by searching eyes and having this real sense of reaching out. And there's a very active desire to get help from anything and anyone. And the freezing, this freezing is different from the immobilization freezing of the hypo, in that there is a freezing, but there is lots of energy to the freeze. There's either jerky movements or there's a desire for movement, even though there may not be any movement. There's a desire for movement still. Within the window is where people would like to remain. Within the window feels much safer. You're able to actually connect, you're able to socially engage, and when you're within the window, you have the ventral vagal nerve is basically in the head, and you're good. And you're able to engage your analytical thinking, you're in the present, you're not in the past, you're not in the future, you're able to just be present, and you have access to the range of human emotions. You have access to anger, sadness, joy, calm, the whole wide range. And they come and they go, and there is an openness in this window. And you can be aware of yourself, and you can be aware of others. So it's a lovely place to be, but many traumatized people spend very little time in this zone. Then we have hypoarousal, and so again, this is the frozen state, and this is when the parasympathetic nervous system, which is connected to the dorsal vagal response, kicks in. And when someone is in this frozen hypoarousal state, their social engagement system is off. When you're sitting with somebody who's in the hypoarousal state, there may be very few words. They may not be able to really see you as a human being in front of them. Their eyes might be down. From a biological perspective, it looks like submit, feigning death. Possums do this, other animals do this. If they think that you're gonna hurt them, they literally curl up and freeze. And humans do this as well. There's a real freezing, the energy is drained, they are experiencing this numbness, they're shut off, and they are like checked out. And you almost wonder if there's a human being in there. And they talk about when someone is in segregation for a long time, this often happens. You literally just check out, and you slide so deeply into yourself that you cannot connect any longer. So this is what it looks like when there's, what others would see. So if you're going in talking to one of these people, you might see that there's a numbness throughout the body. They might not even be able to notice if they're sick. They might ignore physical ailments. They have a sense of things not being real. Tingling in extremities. There's a dissociation. I'm not sure if you've heard of that phrase. It's we talk about dissociation when your body is there, but your mind is elsewhere. And dissociation is connected with the hypoarousal state. There's no energy, and you have difficulty accessing conversations, difficulty accessing emotions, movement. You literally may not move your body very much in a given time period. So there's various therapeutic interventions that are recommended depending on where someone is. So if you're someone who's going in to talk to a prison inmate, it might be helpful to think about, where does this person spend time? If they're in the hyperarousal state, what might I do to help them? And in the hyperarousal state, anything that involves self-soothing can be extremely helpful. Calming, meditation and breathing exercises are fantastic because it literally helps calm the body, because the body is the hyper-aroused, and if you can help the body, you can help the individual, help them develop some affect tolerance, which simply means being more comfortable with various feelings, no matter what they are, the acceptance of all feelings kind of interventions. So I throw out a bunch of acronyms here. I don't know if that's helpful, but I guess it's the therapist in me that says these are a number of therapeutic interventions you may have heard of or not. DBT is the dialectical behavior therapy, and it's based on a lot of the Buddhist acceptance interventions. So it's actually a lot of self-acceptance. Loving kindness is a big part of what it's based on. And so loving kindness is an amazing Buddhist practice that's helpful for everyone, particularly those in hyperarousal. The ACT is one that is used a lot. The acceptance and commitment therapy, it's used a lot from a Buddhist perspective. It's taught through a lot of the Buddhist programs, because again, it involves a lot of the acceptance piece of it. Mindfulness-based stress reduction, again, is a meditation technique for calming, accepting, and EMDR is the trauma-based intervention I was speaking about earlier, which is about eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, and it's about using the senses, either eyes, hands for touch, or hearing, and engaging right brain, left brain stimulus as a way of calming the body. If somebody is in the window, you're able to do a lot more of the traditional therapeutic interventions. Problem solving works well, self-awareness techniques, goal setting, insight-oriented, and all of the ones that involve more of the brain and the thinking, the vagal. So cognitive behavior therapy is very much about changing cognitions. And so obviously, someone has to be consistently in the window, or you might as well, you're wasting your time with the CBT. Brief solution focused therapy is again a goal setting intervention that's very helpful for people who are able to stay in the window, and narrative therapy, again, telling stories is for people in the window. So if you're dealing solely with people in prison, these may be the least useful interventions to learn and to know, because I'm guessing that most prison inmates don't stay in the window very much. But these are certainly some of the more traditional ones. The hypoarousal is another very common prison state, and so these are the body-oriented approaches, all of the sensor-motor ones that involve getting in touch with the body, art-based, whether it's art therapy, music therapy, and then we're back to EMDR again that I mentioned is again a really helpful one for stimulating people to be able to talk more. Back to the dialectical behavior therapy is also quite good. And ECT, some may argue that they don't like it, but certainly ECT as electric shock therapy is one that's not used on the others, but might get used on someone who is so hypo that they cannot connect. And this is probably the most commonly used one in this section. So final conclusions here. I know I've thrown a lot out at you, but the most important thing to keep in mind as you're dealing with individuals in the prison is to really ask yourself, how much is this person able to stay in the window with me? How much do I feel like they're present when I'm talking? Or do they slip, or do my conversations with them make them slip into hyper or hypo mode? And when they slip out of the window, when they slip into the hyper or hypo arousal, how can I help bring them back into the window? What techniques can I learn to help bring them back into the window with me? And recognizing that trauma is very important to understand that it's the history of trauma that has taught them to go out of the window. And so you have to be open to those conversations about trauma, imagining that trauma was a factor, and then thinking about how that influences where the individual is and how they're able to connect with you. And so if you are interested in doing prison work, I would strongly encourage you to investigate the range of therapies that actually will work well with your population. It's always what one does. You pick your population, and then you want to make sure that you're properly trained in therapeutic interventions that will actually help with those populations. That's all I have for today. Like I said, it was a big flyover, so I hope you stay with me. Yeah, any questions of clarification perhaps before we go into...
These clients have a very good understanding of their psychology. They know everything about hyperarousal, fight and flight, or they would actually teach me psychology.
Okay.
And they were very self-injurious. So they would go into their rooms, and when they cannot deal with their trauma and the memories, they have actually, 2 of my clients had entire body cut in 2. I mean, he removes his shirt and said, "You don't get me. Don't tell me how to calm myself, because I know how to calm myself. That's through self-injury." I got stuck with these clients. Nothing worked. And I went to my clinical supervisor and I said, "What do I do?"
Mm-hmm.
And she only said one thing. Maybe no one has ever heard his story.
Okay?
Just let him talk.
Yes.
And I did that. Almost after 10 sessions, I struck a chord with him.
Right.
And we made a connection. And he's no longer self-injurious.
Very good. Thank you. That's great. Yeah. Do you want to, can I give it back to you, and then maybe we'll do questions at the end? Are you good with that?
Shall we do that? Yeah, okay.
All right. Thank you.
This one seems stronger. I don't have a PowerPoint presentation. What I wanted to do was just to have some reflections on trauma that I've observed in prisoners and in the system, and the causes of the trauma, which we would call karma. Also, why we are putting people in prisons in the kind of way we're doing that. And what does that say about our society? It seems to me that, that our society has a lot of ills that we try to avoid looking at. And these ills might be racism, they could be economic ills, us versus them. You could sort of synthesize it into this kind of attitude of us versus them. The people in power want to keep power, the people with money want to keep power, they don't want to share their money. There's all kinds of ills in our society. And these are based from a Buddhist perspective on what we call ego or self-centered thinking that I'm separate from you, or I'm separate from the world. This self-centered thinking contributes to just about every problem we have in this world. And it's wrong because we are interconnected, and we know this from a religious perspective, we know this from a scientific perspective. Because we're interconnected, it does matter what happens to other people. And we have to sort of care about it. When there was in the last election, a politician came to the door and I said, well, I work in the prison system and I'm interested in what's happening there. And she said, well, that's not a hot button issue. That's an understatement if I ever heard one, because we really want to use the prisoners as scapegoats. And the traditional way of thinking of a scapegoat was that, they were goats, and there was some kind of, horned animals, cloven hoof animals. There was something bad about them or evil about them. And you could put all your ills on those, and you could beat them and throw them out. And I get the feeling that prison is functioning as that service in our society of alienating, and it's a conscious thing. That's the problem. It's actually being used so that we can feel better about ourselves. At least I'm not one of them. They're the bad ones. They're the ones we have to separate ourselves from, et cetera, et cetera. And a lot of our policy, even if it's written up in a very positive kind of light, a lot of the actual implementation of the policy is bad. It's actually according to the idea of a scapegoat and according to that feeling of separation and dehumanization of these people. But if we start looking at where their trauma came from things that were, they were babies, they were children. Their parents might have had alcohol or drug problems. They might have been in a difficult situation. They might have grown up in a racist situation where they were ostracized from the community. It doesn't have to be racist. It could just be, you had a disability. It could be anything. But a lot of people grew up with these kinds of stigmas. Where did they come from? Some of these problems go back a generation before. Think of the residential schools. Why do we have so much higher percentage of Native people? Because residential school system created trauma. And that trauma, if you talk to Native people, they know very well it's going to take 2 or 3 generations to work itself out. Now, it's going to take longer if we don't help it. It'll take less time if we help people integrate and bring them into society. The Native people used to be part of Canadian fabric. They were a minority, but they were part, they built the high towers in Manhattan, they built bridges in Quebec and Ontario. But during the Depression, there was a conscious push to put them back onto reservations and to get rid of that population of people competing for jobs. So this was a kind of a bad start. So as Canadians, a lot of us like to think of ourselves as good guys. We don't really want to look at our bad side, our shadow side, like John was talking about, the shadow side of prison, the shadow side of our society. Even calling it shadow side is a shadow. So basically, looking at these causes, my father was in the Air Force. He flew a Spitfire. After the war, they didn't talk about PTSD, but I know he had so many good qualities, but he was alcoholic. And because of that, trying to repress those things, trying to self-medicate, a lot of the problems that I had as a young person actually could have landed me in jail because I was about this close. That's why I'm interested in this field. I was doing drugs, I was getting into trouble, and it was escalating. And so basically, that was because an unrecognized problem, an undealt with problem in our society. And I think that generation of people, and that's why I think it's also important that John, that when we send people overseas and when they deal with the trauma of being a soldier and causing harm, that they're going to have to deal with that, their children are going to have to deal with that. So when we look at it from that perspective, there's this past trauma, there's this kind of karma that carries on, and it's just not, it's not isolated because it causes a future cause. And so this future cause is what we're dealing with. How can we prevent the future cause? Well, when you're in prison, before you're in prison, maybe your parents were fleeing a war zone. They might have been veterans, as I said, prisoners of war, genocide survivors in my generation, the children of genocide survivors. And then the children act out, and then they cause crimes, they do harm, and then that's the cause of them going into jail. But then they have the problem of the prison system itself, the way they're treated, they're dehumanized, living with other people that have even more serious problems, perhaps, because we're not separated. We absorb mind states of those around us. So if you're in a setting where everybody's mind state is negative, you're going to be negatively affected as well. And you may not know that that's what's causing your depression, your anxiety, your dark feelings, because you're being treated as if you're a bad person right from the get-go. So there are also the trauma in prison of being branded. If somebody did a high-profile crime, sort of a murder, or some kind of, sometimes people were put in prison even though they were children, they get branded. And then the authorities, the guards, know what their crime was. Maybe it was against a police person or against somebody else that they identify with, in which case they're going to even get worse treatment. And that treatment is going to carry on throughout a 25 or 30-year sentence. They're not going to lose that brand that they've had. So this is one of the problems of the present trauma, is how can they improve if we keep on treating them like animals or like evil people or like bad people? How could they possibly improve? I don't think there's very many people in this room that could flourish under conditions like that. These are very difficult conditions for any human being. There's the kind of trauma of dealing with people. I've heard people say this in prison. Other chaplains have told me they've heard the same thing. Some of the guards say that they don't believe these people can ever be out in the community, that they're bad, they'll never reform. Reform is off the table. They think that their purpose as guards, and I'm just saying there are some individuals, actually the percentage was shocking to me, that this one person told me. He said it was higher than 50% of the guards in one prison think that their job is to punish these people. That's actually what they think their job is. They're hired from a community, they're not educated, they're not given sort of sensitivity training in any way, and they're taught that, and there's a kind of an atmosphere of a kind of a clubbiness. In fact, this clubbiness can get to the point where the guards are actually not that different from criminal gangs. There's a gang mentality amongst them. So they can get away with something if they make a mistake. Then the guards think, okay, you're one of us, you've made a mistake, we've got something over on you, you'll stick up for us as we'll stick up for you. I mean, if that's not healthy. So that's present trauma. Other kind of present trauma is telling prisoners that they're going to get out or they're going to be released to a lower security institution, like go down to medium or to minimum, or they're going to have day parole, or they're going to have this, that, or the other. I've known prisoners that have been telling me this for a year, and then all of a sudden it's, oh, well, we lost, or you missed the time on it, or, all kinds of games that are played on these people that would be, anyone would find unfair, anyone would have a hard time not getting angry, and you are going in and you're trying to tell these people not to be angry, and to be reasonable, and to grow up. And yet, everything that they see, every influence to them, is telling them the exact opposite. So there's this kind of institutional trauma. There's the future trauma. The future trauma is actually getting out. That's one of the big future traumas. There was an individual in the prison that I go to not that long ago, who was a committed member of a religious community, went to all of the things that they offered, and was considered a really, everybody liked this person. They committed suicide on the day of their release. Nobody saw it coming. Nobody. Possibly because there wasn't enough psychological profiling, or there wasn't any testing, or there wasn't, because they were doing everything they had to do, but nobody knew that underneath this person had tremendous fear, tremendous anxiety about getting out. 25 or 30 years, you're institutionalized. You don't know how to respond or how you will respond. You know the world has changed an awful lot since you got thrown in, and you have no idea whether you can deal with it or not. And this is your home now. There's another thing you see, in some prisons sometimes, and you'll do a talk or you'll do something, and you'll be full of enthusiasm, and you look around the room, and there's this what's called flat affectation. And you're going like, why aren't you responding? Why aren't you smiling or scowling or something? It's because it's considered dangerous to show your emotions. It's a dangerous place to reveal anything about yourself. And so you get institutionalized, and you don't know how to have fun, you don't have free time, you don't know how to do anything on your own, and you're supposed to take one of these people and put them, and they're supposed to be ready to go back into society. That's very, very frightening for a lot of people. And you can see them undermine their ability to go back. You can see them sort of pull the rug out from under themselves sometimes, or sometimes it's, sometimes it's intentional or unconscious. Sometimes it's just, it's done to them even. So there's past, present, and future trauma. It's quite a difficult situation. So I had a couple of stories about illustrating this. A prisoner recently, he had done a lot of positive things. The parole officer seemed to be really behind his work. He got transferred from a medium to a minimum. His work in the minimum, he was given permission, he was going to get out, he was going to get parole. Border security arrested him at the gate. Why? Why let him out? Just to arrest him. He got arrested. I tried to go to Maplehurst. He was being held in Maplehurst provincial jail. They had a lockdown. It happened to be Super Bowl night. I wondered if there was any relationship with the lockdown and Super Bowl night. Who knows? But anyway, the point was, I couldn't get to visit him. When I went to the jail, they said, "Oh, your credentials are federal credentials. You don't have any credentials here." I said, "Well, I'm just visiting as a person. This is off the job anyway." He said, "Well, come back tomorrow. Come back another time." But he was taken out of there. He did his lawyers got him off. He was working, he was in a halfway house. He actually came to the temple, meditated, was welcomed. His wife came. She cooked for the people at the temple. His son came. He worked there. Very nice people. Wonderful response. All of a sudden, I got an emergency call. He had told his parole officer that normally prisoners that are landed or who have been in prison are not allowed out. They get deported. She called the authorities. They arrested him in front of his son at the halfway house. It was traumatic for the boy. I saw the boy afterwards. He was clearly traumatized by this. So this process is continuing. It's continuing through a nasty element, a vindictive element that we have in our society that we have to really look at and uproot if we're going to go anywhere as a society. Another prisoner found that the medication that he was on was actually adverse. It was, the side effects of medication can be quite dramatic. And the so-called side effects were causing numbness. He felt dull. He couldn't meditate. He was part of my group. He couldn't meditate. When he complained and said he didn't want to take it, they said, "Well, you can refuse treatment, but of course that's going to go on your record." What a catch-22. You can't, if you don't want to take this medication, that means you're fighting against the system. You're fighting against us, and therefore you're going to get a black mark on your thing and your chance of parole. So he's taking the medication, even though he can hardly meditate or think for himself when he's on it. And so actual human rights are being abused in prison, as you've heard of Ashley and her rights that were squashed. The head of CSC, I read an email that said that they're fighting against the ban, the 15-year ban, or 15-day ban. So CSC doesn't like the idea of, and actually I saw in the courts that they're going to have a stay. 15-day ban is now not going to be implemented until the courts have decided whether it's constitutional or not, even though it's quite clearly bad for prisoners. It's a bad model. So we've got a very bad model that we're working with here. One notorious inmate who did a Bonnie and Clyde thing about 30 years ago was let out for a medical procedure. The guards decided to leave him in between in an area where he couldn't be seen by anybody, and they just left him there for 5 or 6 hours. He couldn't get a glass of water. The painkillers wore off. He was in agony. A nurse couldn't go see him. Nobody could see him because he was in between the gates. I saw another prisoner who was a very elderly black man, shackled, feet and hands, being led out of the paddy wagon to a wheelchair. I wished I had a camera, it's like slavery all over again, and he wasn't going to run away. He was being led to a wheelchair. Why did he need to be shackled, cuffed, hands and feet? It was dehumanizing. So you see a lot of things inside that are very, they're hard to see. They are hard to see, and they're hard to work with. Having said that, but one of the big challenges is to go back fresh every day. Not to carry the past into the present or the future. And to look at it as Yeah, maybe that happened yesterday, but tomorrow it may be different. Maybe there'll be a different attitude. Maybe there'll be a different perspective. Maybe we will be able to reach through. I had a guard, this is kind of a funny story because this guard I had taken a Buddhist figure into the medium side from the minimum side. And I didn't sneak it in, but I didn't exactly advertise it either. And we had our ceremony, I was coming back, and this guard said to me, "Where did that come from?" I said, "Well, I brought it from the minimum side to the medium side, and I'm taking it back because it belongs on the minimum side." And they said, "Does that have a gate pass?" And I thought, that would be a great title for a book. Does the Buddha have a great gate pass? So, this guard and I, every time, "Oh yeah," he said, "I wouldn't have let you bring that in." And I said, "I know." And he looked embarrassed, to his credit. But every time I saw him, I could see this kind of difficulty with him. I was there a few weeks back. He was working on the minimum side, and he said, he saw me leaving, and he said, "Oh, are you the Buddhist teacher here?" And I said, "Yeah, I'm the Buddhist chaplain." And he said, "I saw a documentary about Buddhism. It is really interesting. I am so glad I saw it." You know, change can happen. Change in people can happen. It requires education, that's all. It doesn't, these people aren't bad people. They probably get sort of trapped into a kind of a way of relating to prisoners and a way of relating to others. But I think that it's really important that we understand that we have to work on the whole system. It's not, you know, piecemeal. It's got to be the whole thing. Some of the prisoners I've worked with, one fellow was, he couldn't sit still for 5 minutes. He was in that hypo state. I just told him, "Listen, no matter what you do, just keep doing it. If you have to get up, you can get up, but just keep doing it. Do it as long as you can. Next time you'll be able to do it a bit longer. He's out now. He's going to come, you know, he says, I'm going to get my apartment in a month, and I'll come and see you. So, you know, there are good stories. He learned how to meditate. He learned how to overcome some of those knee-jerk reactions that were based on trauma. He learned how to work with himself and with others, and he did get, you know, from medium to minimum and minimum to a halfway house, and he will succeed, I think. I mean, you do see these cases. It is possible. The things that I believe in, I don't think meditation has to be a religious-based thing. I think it could be, meditation can be used by all kinds of people. I think we have to stop labeling, you know, this is the Eastern religion, this is Western. We have to start interacting with each other. We have to start talking to each other and helping each other. Strategies that work, that's all that's important. It doesn't matter which, because the prisoner has his own affinity. And if we work with the person's affinity, that's going to be successful. If we try to impose something on somebody, it's probably not going to be successful. So these are some of the reflections that I've had from working with offenders. It may be that meditation helps, it may be that forgiveness helps. Mostly these guys have to forgive themselves. I think that's all I've got to say right now. We've got about 20 minutes. We can answer questions or just have a group discussion if somebody has something to say.
Thank you both for a wonderful presentation. I have a case, a client in Etobicoke prison, and I've been seeing it for 2 years. And I go when I see the clients, I always believe they have a goal that they can tap into if they choose to. With this particular gentleman, I'm finding a struggle, not because he's an atheist, because I'm working in spiritual direction, but it's somehow a disconnect between his spiritual mind and his ego mind. And the ego mind is controlling his life because he spent his life in fight or flight, being homeless since 13, on the streets, foster homes, and so on. So when he got into prison because of a serious crime, he's still, I think, going back to his default. And there are two defaults. One is default of being born in the image of God, and I think he senses that, but he doesn't know how to relate to it. And the other default is to protect himself. So he's either in hypo or in hyper. And I think the best thing that I can do is keep on listening to him, because he's always been judged and he's never been listened to enough. So I'm just sharing my dilemma of how to reach into his goal.
Thank you. I would say part of it is recognizing it, being you showing up and being in the window is somewhat contagious, in the sense that it is one way of sharing and connecting. And so that if you show up and consistently can stay in the window of calm, affect regulation, it does get shared with this gentleman as well. And you it may not happen overnight, but it certainly is the one thing you can do that helps that you show him there's another way. And what he chooses to do and how long he can be in the window with you, maybe seconds. But sometimes it helps to develop a vocabulary with people to invite them into the window with you. And so whether it's a formal, you were talking a little bit about how if someone can meditate for a minute before they stop meditating or can't be there anymore, then that's fine. Another way is talking about this in the window tolerance of saying, can you be with me here, calm, present, in a conversation, and let's together watch when you fall out, and can we together bring you back in? And so just engaging with them to desire being in the window can be, a therapeutic conversation. So it's not you doing it to him, but inviting him into that calm space with you would be one way to perhaps shape your conversations. Do you want to add anything? No. Okay.
Or
Yeah, thanks again to both of you for putting such an important word on the work that we do in prisons, which is trauma. Couple pieces I just wanted to share. I really believe that being trauma-informed involves a very spiritual principle, which is the principle of meeting someone without judgment and knowing them to be very likely coming from trauma, and also acknowledging the trauma we all come from, so that we're in the same boat. It's not a caregiver and care receiver dynamic, and something.
Not an us and a them.
It's never an us and a them, and we never know what's going on, and we always have to be mindful of what's coming up for us, right? So something I try to do when I'm in these architectures of violence, this is what I call prisons, they're architectures of violence. I'm by no means the first person to call them that. If we read our Foucault, the panopticon and how prisons are designed are to dehumanize, but also to separate humanity from itself. So I often will think of the prisons as a bunch of nervous systems walking around failing to interact with each other from a place of cohesion. And that includes the officers, that includes the staff. And something that I think both Poonam and I have learned in the RTC context, in the regional treatment centers where mental health is supposed to be centered, but it isn't, is that we can act as spiritual care providers in a bridging way. So we see that those guards have been trained to enact racism, to be hyper-vigilant, to use their fight or flight response in violent ways with impunity, And we can be a kind of mirror through showing up in the window. I love that phrase. Now I have like a phrase for it, for showing up in the window and seeing them where they're at without a uniform, you know, in whatever way we need to tell ourselves, because I get really hyper aroused. I've been put in my place more than once by officers, and my whole response comes online, right? Anyway, this is a fascinating
And it should
conversation.
continue to, because
I hope it does.
right?
That's right.
So we're not trying to take that out of you, the person working with them, or them.
Exactly.
We're trying to show up as humans and recognize that these responses were put into us for a reason. And so it's more about understanding what that reason is.
Absolutely, and it's not about instrumentalizing the response to serve the kind of harm that you're talking about, Taigen. So, totally grateful for all of that way of languaging it. I wanted to also say that in the mental health stream in prisons, you're mostly going to get a CBT response. So most of the psychologists, most of the psychiatrists are teaching CBT techniques. And I think it's a very problematic thing because, like you said, it's not so effective when people are in hyper or hypo. So what I try to do as a spiritual care provider is to really see my spiritual tools as addressing hyperarousal. So meditation is one thing, but wherever someone's spirit enters is what helps them self-soothe. So it might be hanging out looking at a tree. It might be engaging their cultural practices. Could be smudging, could be prayer, could be having a conversation about the Bible. Like, whatever they're going to come to me and share is meaningful for them, I'm going to put into the category of self-soothing and try to build a practice with them for themselves that allows them to self-soothe, because every single day they're going to be going in and out of hyperarousal.
And what's interesting is that, as you're pointing out, many of the spiritual rituals and cultural rituals are actually self-soothing.
Exactly.
Isn't that ironic? And yet we haven't always had the framework for it. But so many, like you just mentioned, prayer, nature,
smudging. But I think what we need to do is get out of our Western mindset, right? Actually, human culture, our ancient traditions, our indigenous traditions, wherever we're from on the planet, gave us these tools. We knew how to connect with our ancestors. Every single culture, tradition in the world has a way of connecting with ancestors, has a way of connecting with the planet. So for me, it's actually, science is now catching up. It's not the other way around. And I think as spiritual care providers, we're really familiar with that. So anyway, this is such an important conversation, and I want to thank everyone here for engaging it.
thank you.
I have so much I could say to this. I've been a provincial chaplain for 10 years. It's when I retired from the East Detention Center. For people who are hoping to volunteer, I would especially say, listen to the people. When we listen to people, we validate them as human beings. And you may very well, as a volunteer, be the first person who ever actually listened to this individual in his entire life. And I have had so many people, I always worked adult male maximum security, and I've had so many guys say that. I miss you, the first one who ever listened to me. And so we need to do that. The other thing is, we need to prioritize the importance of having volunteers in the prison. Right now it's very difficult in some places to get in as a volunteer. I started out as a volunteer when I was an Emmanuel student in Central East in Lindsay. I worked there for 3 years, and then I worked at the East for 7 years after that, full-time permanent. And right now, I really believe that there's less access for volunteers than there was. And we as the people of Ontario need to sort that problem. I don't have any solution for it, and I'm hoping some people have a little more to say about that, but we really need that. We need to let the people inside know that the people outside know they exist and care about them and want to help them make the changes that they already know they have to make. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, thank you. Thank you both. It's quite interesting. I'm not a prison chaplain. I did a little bit of prison chaplaincy, but I'm very much interested in well, the idea of Buddhist chaplaincy. I'm a master now. I'm at Master University. We're working on expanding the chaplaincy to non-Christian, because at the moment that's all we've got is Christian chaplains at the university. And so I'm interested in these terms, as we were talking earlier. I was talking to Roshi earlier about like multi-faith, or just the word faith. And so to start, something that you mentioned was about meditation not having to be religious, not having to be even spiritual. And absolutely, there's something that most of us Buddhists do say, of calling it religious or spiritual, is that it involves this comprehensive system of beliefs that involves questions of ultimate concern, that gets recognition, at the very least, as this creed, really, or as something to be recognized as valid, as having validity, as having some validity apart from science. I mean, science is one way to give things validity, but in a social context, calling something a religion, for example, or a system of beliefs, a creed, gives it recognition. And so, I mean, my question is in regards to the challenges that you were mentioning that Buddhism has in finding legitimacy in a hegemonic Christian-based system that uses words like faith. I mean, to call Buddhism a faith makes it problematic, because that's not really what we're going in there to do. We're going in there to teach something that we probably believe is quite scientific, that even we may not have the scientific studies to back it or not. And so it's more, my question and the things I'm interested in is looking at ways that can be changed. I mean, there seems to me to be in many ways a potential case to be made, even from the perspective of the OHCR, the Military Human Rights Code, as non-discrimination based on creed. If Buddhism has to conform to you go in there, your role is to provide faith to these people. Well, that's not really what Buddhism is about. That's not why I'm there. But my system of beliefs is equally valid. How is that struggle going, I guess, is what I'm asking, and how are you faring, and what are your thoughts on where that can go? And I guess just I'm very interested in this recognition that even using the word multi-faith to me is highly problematic, as I said, because it's a Christian word. It's a Christian conception of the kind of thing that we're talking about.
Well, that's really true. It is challenging to feel like you're a little bit out of the box. The box of chaplaincy. Amongst your fellow chaplains, you may be seen as other. But there are other chaplains that are pagan chaplains. And I asked around about that, and my understanding is sometimes people have, negative reactions towards organized religion, and the pagan path is one where they feel safe. The prisoners feel safe. So I keep on trying to base it on what's good for the prisoners, not on what I believe or what, but I do think that education is really important, but I also think that the Buddhists need to, as you say, establish themselves as a bona fide religious group, even though you don't feel that that's, it's not a religious creed necessarily, but you want to. I've got a pragmatic approach. It doesn't matter, whatever works to change. And so change has to go slowly. It has to be, it's usually one-on-one. It does like that one guard. I think that, to me, that's a great victory, just to break through one person and to deal with chaplains that might have a bias against this faith. I'll just say, well, if somebody from my group wants to practice with you, I'm not going to tell them they can't, go back to being a Christian or go back to being Jewish or anything. I just want what's best for the prisoner. So the struggle, I think, has to be done on so many different levels, but I think basically trying to avoid myself, us versus them, when I go in, when I talk to somebody who I know actually sees me as competition. It's quite challenging because, it's a two-way street, right? It's not, I have to look at myself too and say, are you criticizing their religion? Do you have a bias against their approach? Which I might have, because I grew up in that faith. It didn't work for me. So I might have in other words, what am I bringing to the table? So it's actually a good practice. Going into prison is a good practice. It makes me work on myself more deeply, because, and I don't know what the answer is, institutionally, but I think we have, this is why Chris started this idea. We sat down and said, we do have to have a bit of an organization and a visible presence that the government will recognize. That I think that is the next step for Buddhists around Ontario to have a central kind of say, where they see so politicians will take us seriously. Anyway, there's a number of other questions, yeah.
We're almost 1 o'clock.
Oh, it's almost lunchtime. Who's?
Yeah, it's not short about the term multi-faith because it's changing now. So there was mentioned about the spiritual care provider. So like in the federal system, I think because you're basically a chaplain, a spiritual care provider for people with faith or no faith.
Exactly.
Yeah, so yeah, it's changing. But of course, the concept of multi-faith, faith or religious belief from like an anthropological perspective, you have a creed, you have a belief system, you have the cult, the worship system, and you have the code, the scriptures and so on. But like as I said, in a federal system, and the taxpayers funded chaplaincy, it's moving towards what we call now, I should mention that, spiritual care provider. And you connect and you serve whoever, faith or no faith. Thank you.
So maybe just one last one, and then we have lunch, and then afterwards, 2 o'clock we have round table, then we can have more interactive discussion. So just one last
And
comment.
I think that's why I'm advocating change in policy. To hire chaplains not based on what their religion is, because we may practice whatever I want to practice. Point at is what my client practices. So that is why we need to bring spiritually integrated, client spiritually integrated care. So that's important to not to bracket my faith. I am born Hindu, I'm a Catholic, I connect very well with Buddhism and Islam. But that's my faith. That's not my client's faith. And this is where the policy needs to be changed, how we are hiring the chaplain. Chaplain should not be hired because you want to represent one particular religious group. We need to be hired. We have a training to deal with client of every spectrum. Atheist, non-religious practice, they believe in a Abrahamic, no. What they believe is what we need to cater to them. That's what I believe in.
Thank you. You have some last comments before we break?
Go ahead. I agree wholeheartedly with you, and I think it's just going to take time. It's starting to happen, as John said, and but it is going to take some time. You can't just fire people that are in there. You've got to. But I think that's why these programs at the U of T are really important, and they're going to bring people on. The other thing that I would like to say is I don't like the model of the, John touched on this, of the what's it called, a contract with a contractor, like you're a contractor, not even part of the system, you're hired by a contractor, so you're one step removed. I think that system is it's not good for the inmates. Yeah. So, lunchtime.
Yeah, so we break 1 hour for lunch,